Hello, and welcome to our session on open source and accessibility. So my name is Ed Summers, and this is my brand new CNI dog, Loki, who you may have heard earlier. And we've been working together for just a few months, so he's still getting accustomed to being in front of an audience on stage. I know. So we're going to have a great panel up here to talk about open source and accessibility, and that'll probably include Loki. So there are approximately 1.3 billion people with disabilities, and as a group, we experience lower outcomes across many areas of life, including education, employment, and civic engagement. We call that gap in outcomes the disability divide. And we know that technology can help bridge the disability divide. And during the panel today, we'll focus exclusively on how open technologies and open source software can help do that. Our panelists today are a group of esteemed experts in the field of accessibility. And at this time, I'd like to invite them to the stage. They include Joshua Mealy, Joe Devon, and Christine Mendoza. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us here at GitHub University for this important conversation. And let's start with just a brief introduction. Maybe go from the audience's left to their right, starting with Christine and coming this way.
Yeah, my name is Christine Mendoza, and I'm a first-year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University.
And I'm Joe Devon. I am co-founder of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, chair of the GAD Foundation, and I'm also co-host of a podcast called Accessibility and Gen AI.
I'm Josh Mealy. I'm a blind scientist, researcher, developer of cool things for blind people and people with disabilities. I am the founder and president of the board of a nascent organization called the Center for Accessibility and Open Source.
Fantastic. Let's get started with this discussion and just define some terms so we can level set on terms. Christine, can you define the term disability?
Yeah, so oftentimes disability is thought of as some deviation from the norm. But there's actually an alternate model of disability called the social model of disability. And that posits that disability arises from a mismatch between the environment and a person. So for example, my leg paralysis isn't truly disabling until there's no elevator or step or ramp for me to get into my apartment dwelling, which has happened a lot. And oftentimes we say that we might suffer from disability, but actually that's a little bit of a misnomer because suffering does not equal disability. I can say that I have suffered more from inaccessibility than from disability.
Great, thank you. And Joe, can you take this one? What is accessibility?
Accessibility, or digital accessibility, is the practice of building digital products in a way that is accessible, navigable, usable by people with disabilities.
Super. And last one, there's this term assistive technology. Josh, can you take that one?
Yeah, and since I'm going last, I'm going to swoop in and kind of clean up on the other definitions. One thing I want to point out is when I introduced myself, I mentioned that I used the word blind first. Often people will talk about people with disabilities, people first language. I prefer, when in my own personal identity, I say that I live a blind first existence. I'm proud of it. I'm pleased to be blind, and I'm not trying to minimize it. So I like to put it up front. And I call accessibility, I think accessibility, pure and simple, is usability for people with disabilities. Boom, period. And what we do as people with disabilities, when we are using computers or other digital tools and many other tools in life, we use additional technologies. The technologies that we use are things like screen readers, things like eye trackers, eye gaze trackers, things like communications, alternative communications boards. These are assistive technologies, although, you know, the terms don't always help us. Sometimes the terms get in the way. I think when we say assistive technology, we mean the things that people with disabilities use as the sort of impedance matching devices and tools to use the everyday tools that may or may not have been designed with accessibility in mind.
Yeah, I love that, and yeah, thanks for pulling that together. And you know, I was just sitting here thinking that one example of accessibility might be that ramp over there that comes up to this stage as opposed to stairs. You know, that means that more people can use it. Christine uses a wheelchair, and I would consider that to be a piece of assistive technology. And when you put accessibility, meaning you know the properties of artifacts that are created by humans, together with assistive technologies, you know, put those things together, and when you do it well, that means those artifacts are usable by people with disabilities. I don't know, do you consider your king to be?
It's all one big happy family, though, right? Like, I mean, if this stage were designed without a ramp, then the ramp would be assistive technology. But if the stage incorporates the ramp as an explicit piece of its design, then it's just kind of part of the stage. And so that's why I think some of these terms get in the way sometimes.
Yeah. All right, so we wanted to start this discussion with going right down to the tarmac with a specific case study. And Christine, when you were an undergraduate, you created an open source project to solve a specific problem, a specific access problem that you experienced. Can you tell us about the problem, the access problem that you were experiencing?
Yeah, so together with a team of student developers, I created an app that is still in progress called Luminary, which is for accessible campus wayfinding. And when people ask me how we came across the idea, I always go back to the beginning of my sophomore year. I was one of the COVID graduates, and so we were in person in 2021. I go to UNC Chapel Hill, which is the oldest public university in the nation. And with age comes a lot of accessibility considerations. And so my very first weekend there, the fire alarm went off, and having not been told exactly what to do and being on an upper floor, I was sort of wandering around trying to figure out how to signal somebody that, hey, I'm still here. Is there an actual fire? I'm not sure. And if it was just me, I would have just brushed it off. I mean, to me, it's just me. But it just so happens that there were other people with a variety of disabilities. There were a couple of freshmen who also used wheelchairs. There are those who are neurodivergent, blind, those with hearing impairments. And as I realized, like, the prevalence of the problem, I mean, as Ed pointed out, there are a billion people with disabilities in the world. Then we realized that, well, what about if we do information sharing? Because we had a group chat, actually, where we would share, like, hey, this elevator is down. Why not operationalize that to make sure that it's spread everywhere and easy for people to access the information? And so I concentrate on accessibility of built environment features, physical features, but kind of intertwined with that is digital access.
Yeah, awesome. So how did you leverage open source in order to not only solve this access problem for yourself, but anyone globally who experiences the same type of problem?
Yeah, so as a small student organization, we were not on a grant. We had an advisor, but no funding. There are like a few small student funding organizations, but as we were just getting started, we were sort of thinking well, okay, we don't have the time or resources to build a whole entire startup from the get-go. So we were wondering how do we leverage the existing technologies that people have built in a way that is also extensible by others so that they can also build off of what we build. And so the obvious answer to that is open source. And so for the app Luminary, we decided to rely on OpenStreetMap. I think tends to be popular among bikers, but it also has great pedestrian paths. And there are a variety of other standards that have been built on OpenStreetMap.
So, quite often technology is a piece of the solution, but technology has to has to be developed, and it has to work within this broader, socioeconomic, sometimes political, legal, bureaucratic context. What were the kind of the environmental factors surrounding Luminary, and and how did you negotiate those environmental factors to create an effective solution?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that, because oftentimes when we look at the physical environment is what's obvious to our senses. There's a ramp, there's a curb cut, there's ASL captioning, but actually accessibility is intertwined with so many systems. So one model of the environment that I like to borrow from comes from public health. I used to be a public health student. I used to be many things. But anyways, and it sort of posits the environment as a system of, I guess, spheres that kind of share the same center. And so the innermost sphere is like the individual part of the environment. So to take an example of examining mobility for, say, myself, I have an individual characteristic of leg paralysis. I use a wheelchair, so maybe I don't like to hop over stairs. I mean, that would be fun to fly, but maybe not today. But yeah, and so as I'm going along, maybe I want to get from one building to another, and it could be that I'm going by myself, but the next sphere is the interpersonal sphere. Maybe I actually have a friend who has a car. And so suddenly my mobility options are expanded, and I'm able to get a lot farther, a lot faster. The next sphere is local and working conditions. So for example, if I work in a place that has a lot of parking, which I don't, Carnegie Mellon only has enough parking for 10% of its population, then they might incentivize people to use cars by offering free parking. I don't actually use a car, so that doesn't quite work for me. And the last sphere is the broader systems. And I really like dwelling in kind of the broader systems realm because in my point of view, that also includes the data. Because data itself is an interface to so many things. All of our policies are informed by data, especially in the age where tracking is becoming more prevalent and AI is on the rise. And so going back to Luminary, we wanted to make sure that people of all different disabilities were represented in the actual data.
Thank you. All right, let's zoom out from the specific case of Luminary and zoom all the way out to look at open source and accessibility from a systems perspective. Josh, how do you think about that space?
There's a couple of important distinctions I want to make. I talked about the accessible technology. I talked about how usability, accessibility and usability for people with disabilities is sort of the way we, what we think of as sort of making space for people with disabilities. The thing about open source is we're all here because we value the things that open source brings to the world, the kind of equity and supportive education and employment opportunities and other opportunities, both financial and sort of enrichment and et cetera. Open source sort of expands possibility. And that's true for everyone, and it's particularly true for people with disabilities. You mentioned that there's over 1 billion people with disabilities in the world, and that's, by the way, kind of a conservative number. And we are disproportionately underserved in terms of opportunity, in terms of economic development, in terms of civil rights. Everything that applies to why open source is valuable for the world is squared and cubed for people with disabilities. We need the advantages that open source delivers more than most other people do. So that applies across the board. It applies not only to making sure that open source is the big projects that we all know about, like Linux and Drupal and WordPress, and all of these are accessible and able to be used by people with disabilities, but also the other projects, the AT project, like open source screen readers, open source Braille translators, open source eye tracking systems. These also need to be supported through open source, because if people don't, people need to be able to have access to not only the tools that we need to write and communicate, but we need access to we as people with disabilities need access to the tools that we need in order to access the other tools. So all of these things are really critical, and I think that one of the most important things that we can do as advocates of accessibility and open source is to support everything possible to expand people with disabilities' participation in open source communities. That, to me, is the fundamental thing that we need to be working towards, because as we expand communities to include people with disabilities, by breaking down barriers on the tools that we use, by breaking down barriers on the assumptions that we have, that will naturally lead to better outcomes for accessibility. As more people with disabilities are involved directly in the creation and conversations around the delivery and development of open source, the better open source will be at building equity for people with disabilities into its systems and deliverables. So that's what I see as sort of the big picture, the big need right now. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, I'm working on this organization called the Center for Accessibility and Open Source, and that is its overall mission, is to bring, sustainably bring accessibility into the open source world and open source communities by building disability inclusion into the communities that sustain open source projects.
You want to give us a preview of anything on the roadmap for CHAOSS?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of stuff that can, everything from education, supporting people in learning about accessibility and disability in an open source context, working on the accessibility of open source tooling that people use in their creation of open source projects, helping people like GitHub think about, I mean, you're already doing a great job thinking about how that works, but we can all, the more people we have at the table, the more thinking we can do, and the better we can do it at the outcomes. I think hackathons are a great example of something that can be really cool, but often miss the mark for disability and accessibility. I think there are, I'd love to help create an environment where we can really do disability and accessibility hackathons right. So I think, and of course, just working directly with open source maintainers, open source participants and contributors to help people with disabilities participate in those communities. I think, maybe internships for students, college students with disabilities to actually participate in specific open source communities and start breaking down those barriers, opening doors.
Love it. And I personally, and I can speak for GitHub, we are eager to collaborate with you and the Center for Accessibility and Open Source.
CHAOSS.
It's chaotic.
It's chaos.
Yeah, it's going to be chaos.
And also, I want to say, CHAOSS is not the only, obviously there are lots of, the GAD Foundation, the Teach Access, there are many organizations out there that are already doing really great work in this space. I think CHAOSS is going to be a sort of a network that brings these, the stakeholders together to really focus on the disability inclusion in open source projects and to focus on the accessibility of the outcomes.
Beautiful. All right, let's pivot towards the accessibility of mainstream software, the software that we all use to live, work, learn, and play. And Joe, let's maybe you can help us understand how open source developer tools are helping developers create mainstream software that is also accessible.
Yeah, there are several packages out there, like AxeCore is very helpful because it allows you to do automated testing of accessibility for websites. Lots of organizations are forking that and creating their own tools. You also have Pally, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but it's PA11Y, that also does that. And you've got Accessibility Insights and Lighthouse. And I'd say the entire community, every time that you go out and you are doing some work in this space and you share it on GitHub in open source, it just opens the door for the entire community to do more with it. And I'm super excited now with Copilot, all of these AI copilots that are coming out are allowing me personally, I've been outside of coding for a decade, and now I'm back at it almost all my free time. And I plan to open source everything that I can, that I'm working on, that doesn't have a price tag to it, is all gonna be open source. And I think that we're seeing the beginning of a revolution.
Oh, yeah, isn't it great? Joe, about 10 years ago, you co-founded an organization called the Global Accessibility Awareness Day Foundation. And over the last 10 years or so, I know that we call it the GAD Foundation. I know that GAD has been really active in improving the accessibility of open source. Can you bring us up to speed on what you've been doing there?
Sure. So just to be clear, the Global Accessibility Awareness Day started a little over 13 years ago. And the day actually started as a grassroots movement. My dad was struggling with his banking because he couldn't go physically. He was hitting his mid-80s. I had a little database blog that nobody ever read, and I thought, online banking should have been the solution. It wasn't. I wrote a blog post on there, and to my utter shock, this thing went viral to the tune, we stopped counting when we hit 220 million social media reach. So those 1.3 billion, I think a lot of people don't believe those figures, but I guarantee you my blog post would not have taken off if it wasn't a massive market. And then we threatened to start a foundation from the beginning, but it took us about 10 years. We're so busy just following this grassroots movement. And finally, we thought, all right, it's time to create this. And as part of the foundation, which we did start about 4 years ago, we created the GAD Pledge. And where it really kind of came out was I was working on, I was learning a new framework that was, had a README. It was very, I don't want to name names, but it's huge. And the quick start had inaccessible examples, and I was really bothered by that. So I said, why don't we do this little GAD Pledge where open source projects can take a pledge to make accessibility a core value of what they do. And so I call up my buddy who basically is responsible for voiceover at Apple. He was at Facebook, and I said, how about you take the GAD Pledge for React? And literally the next second he said, yes. And so Facebook took the GAD Pledge for React Native, and then we had Joomla, Ember, JS, Drupal, and Intel took it for an AI project called OpenFL. And the idea is, as these important frameworks take the pledge, it's really thought leadership. I want it to change the culture, because there's a limit to how much we can change organizations in terms of their, when you're trying to make money, it's really hard to enforce on an organization to make things accessible. But if you change the culture where all of us who are building product bake in accessibility because we know how to do it, right, then you're going to have a much more accessible world. So I'd really love to see more thought leadership from these open source projects to take the pledge and say, if you're doing an open source project, it's got to be accessible. It's got to be a value of the project. And that's going to have massive downstream effects on the culture. And that's why I'm so happy. Thank you, Ed, for always involving me in the GitHub accessibility work, because that's where that's the social media for programmers. So very, very happy to be here.
Accessibility is a team sport. Yeah, I think everybody has a role to play. Yeah. We got about 15 minutes left. Let's pivot towards some broad topics. And let's start with the first one of AI. AI represents an enormous amount of opportunity for people with disabilities, but there are clearly risks as well for exclusion. So I'll just open this up for anyone to jump in. How is AI being made accessible for people with disabilities, to benefit with disabilities, and what is the intersectionality of that work within open source communities?
I'm happy to take it, but I know that Josh has a lot of opinions on this. We literally were talking about this right up until we walked on stage. So you want to take?
No, you go first.
Okay. What I was telling Josh is what drives me crazy is I've been on AI panels for 15 years, and every single panel, the topic of bias in data when it comes to AI comes up. And usually the question is, what can we do in order to make sure that there is no bias? There is not a single AI researcher that has not heard about bias in their data. And if they're not doing it, and a lot of them are not, they don't really care. And so there's no point to talk about how do we get AI researchers to understand about bias in the data. What we really have to do is inspire AI researchers to understand the benefits of doing it. And I think there are tremendous benefits, because what is artificial intelligence if not emulating human beings, our abilities? Every one of us has different abilities. So when you come up to disabilities, you might talk about perhaps being blind or being deaf or being in a wheelchair. Those are disabilities. But you can talk about fashion. Some people are better at fashion, some people are better at coding, and some are better at music. Our industry, our community has really studied the differences in everybody's ability, probably more than anyone else. And by taking the data from our community, you're going to build much better models. We don't have enough time here to really go into some of the details, but there's some fascinating angles where people are completely getting it wrong in the AI community because they're not involving people with disabilities. So I've been going out there and speaking about it to the community to try and get more folks inspired to get involved.
I'll just be really succinct. I mean, there's always this, any new technology is very shiny, very sexy, and AI is the shiniest and sexiest thing we've had in a long, long time. And shiny and sexy is scary. The thing that I think we need to remember is there is no we're very accustomed to thinking about technology as solving problems, solving, in this context, solving accessibility problems. There's really great stories out there being told, for example, using AI to describe visual images for accessibility for blind people, describing slides, turning summarizing documents, adding markup to documents so that they're navigable. All kinds of really cool things can be done. For every very cool thing that can be done, somebody else is using AI in 10 other ways to do inaccessible things. Everything from having the UI on your chat bot be inaccessible to having deep bias built into your data set, giving wrong or harmful answers about disability or about accessibility. So there's, it's not a pretty picture. We are going to be building cool things with these tools because we just can't stop ourselves. And some of the things that we build are going to be really bad. But some of them are going to be really cool. And I think the most important thing is not to try to get people to recognize that there are the technical problems that they're doing. The problem with that we need to solve for AI is the same problem that we need to solve in every other accessibility situation. The problems are not usually technical. At the top of the list of problems, the technical problems are not the worst ones. The worst ones are the people problems, where people simply don't understand that people with disabilities are human and need to be included as users for anything that we build. And to help people not only understand about that, but to understand that what the specific needs of people with disabilities are, rather than building things based on assumption and a movie you saw once. So really understanding disability for people who don't already have that, that's the biggest problem across AI and across every other aspect of accessibility. And that's the thing we need to make the most progress on. The best way to do that is to meet people and hang out with people with disabilities. If you don't already have that as part of your world, make that part of your world. You won't learn about it from the movies. You won't learn about disability by reading books. You will learn about disability by hanging out with people who live with disability.
Can I just add one thing to that? Check out GAD.Foundation, because we have something called the GAD Exchange, where we help developers and designers connect up with people with disabilities. We're still working on that, but we have that in the works so that it will help create what you just proposed. Yeah. So had to do a little shout out there.
Nice.
Yeah, great. I want to give Christine a chance to jump into the AI conversation. You want to take a swing?
Yeah, sure. So I come more from the very, very new to AI perspective, which is kind of funny because you would think if I'm young, then maybe I grew up in AI. I didn't. I still remember putting on the VHS, as do I think most of you guys in this room. Although I do get relentlessly teased that maybe I don't know what a CD is. I do know what a CD is. But anyways, in terms of AI, I think one interesting thing to do is to just go out and probe the models. And so one way in which you can probe models for gender bias, for example, is by putting out like a list of features, for example, like let's just say ramps, lighting, and then asking models to pick from a list of terms. In the gender bias example, they might pick normally gendered names. In the disability example, we might extend the example to say like mobility, visual. And when I list these categories, I guess it's for ease of reference, but it's also really important to note that each quote-unquote category is not a monolith. But anyways, and so you can ask models to see like which term they associate with the term in your original list, since they have next word prediction capabilities. Another way to sort of explore it is, I'm a big fan of stories, so I like to ask my models to tell me a story, or pretend that you're a specific persona and tell me a story. And so I did that once with just saying, tell me a story about a kid with spina bifida, me, but maybe not me. A kid with spina bifida and say her teacher who has leukemia. I had a teacher with leukemia, but that's a different story. Anyways, and when it generated the story, there were two main themes that popped up. So first off, I was like, wow, finally there's representation. Like so often we grow up just without any exposure. And I think that's like what makes people sometimes scared to engage in disability, just the lack of exposure. I promise that we don't bite, but anyways, another theme that popped up was the theme of inspiration porn. So if you guys haven't heard that term, it's basically sort of like taking a community and kind of reducing it to the inspirational value. And so unfortunately, the story that this large language model came up with said that, wow, like this person was overcoming their disabilities and became an inspiration to everybody. And I'm just a human. I just want to go to school and get an accessible apartment. I keep bringing up apartments because I'm actually still on an apartment hunt. About 80% of apartments in Pittsburgh, at least from my survey, have stairs to get in, and so a lot of like these factors kind of compound, and it's really interesting, like, and beautiful to think of like the net. Maybe not quite as like glorious when you're actually trying to navigate through the net, but yeah.
Well, we're coming up on time, and I think the key takeaway that I'd like to share, and then I'll give each of the panelists a chance to kind of share their final thoughts, is that disability has always been and will always be an integral part of the human condition. And technology is the same. Like in the modern world, technology is no longer optional. In order to do so many of the things we want to do, and from education to employment to hanging out with friends and working remotely, all these things, technology is absolutely integral as well. And I think that it is up to us, the relatively small number of people at this conference who are working on GitHub, who know how to build tech. It's up to us to decide if everyone gets to participate in technology and therefore participate in modern life, and to what degree the technology will be inclusive. And open source and open source communities are the easiest on-ramp, I think, to making that possible. It's more and more and more, we're removing the barriers from participation in open source for everybody. So let's maybe go from our left to our right, starting with Josh, and maybe a quick 1-minute closing thought. And also, would you please share social handles and places where folks can follow your work?
Thanks, Ed. And just, I didn't say it at the outset, but thanks a ton for organizing this, man. This is an amazing opportunity for us to get our words out there, and it's a great opportunity for people to expand their knowledge and understanding of this area. I guess I would just say, if open source is for everyone, let's make it for everyone. If somebody came to you and told you that your project wasn't working for women, if somebody came to you and told you that African Americans or people in South America couldn't use your project, that wouldn't make you very happy. So people with disabilities are not only, as I said at the beginning, not only do we need access to this, it is disproportionately important for people with disabilities to have the kind of access to free and open source software that everyone should be able to expect. So I also said that you can't learn about disability from the movies. I a little bit lied. I want to encourage everybody, if you haven't seen it, watch Crip Camp. Crip Camp is an amazing on-ramp to the world of disability and disability rights, disability thinking, and accessibility. It's a great 1 hour. You're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in learning about disability and accessibility that you ever would, and it's really fun. It's available on YouTube, Netflix. Again, it's called Crip Camp. Yeah, I just encourage everybody to think about people with disabilities not only using the projects that you work on, but think about how they would use the tools that you use every day to communicate and facilitate your open source communities.
And Josh, where can folks find out more about you?
Oh, yeah, sorry. CAOS.org. You can reach me at chaos.org. You can also find me on the platform formerly known as Twitter at Berkeley Blink, BERKELEY BLINK. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn as Josh Mealy, and I think that's it. I've got an Instagram handle, but I don't use it. I'm too old.
No.
Inspiration, meaning, most people, when they're working, they want to do something that matters. Now, how inspiring is it when you're being asked to create another SaaS product that's super easy to subscribe, you put in your credit card, but super hard to cancel? We're being asked over and over again to build all these dark patterns. And there are two things that inspire me, and I think inspire most of my friends, is doing something innovative and doing something that matters. And when you're building technology, just put in a little bit of effort into building it accessibly. First of all, the solutions are super interesting. Screen reader technology is what first got me interested in accessibility, because I saw a demo of someone who's a friend of mine now accessing the homepage of Yahoo where he worked with a screen reader. And I thought, how cool is that? You can't use a mouse, you can't see the screen, but you have this technology that reads out the page to you. It's just an amazing solution, innovation. And that's what I want to do, is inspire people to understand that this is really a fascinating space. It's a space where you can instantly make a difference and do innovative work. So I'll end with that, and then I'll give the social media, like all of my handles are GitHub at Joe Devon, Twitter at Joe Devon, LinkedIn at Joe Devon, JoeDevon. Reach out to me in any of those locations. Thank you.
And yeah, the final thought I'd like to leave you guys with is, don't be afraid to step out. A lot of times especially with accessibility maybe not permeating some spaces, I acknowledge it can be a little bit nerve-wracking to step out, but there's a lot of resources out there in Google. There's a world of opportunity there by exploring digitally and physically. And make use of collaboration. So for example, there's an organization called Digital Accessibility Liaisons at my previous undergrad. I mentioned the student developers. We eventually went to admin and asked them, do you have an API for like maintenance? And they were like, oh, actually we don't. And so now UNC has an elevator API because of that. So never hesitate to ask questions. And speaking of questions, obviously we're out of time, but you can reach me at Christine, IYM, on GitHub. And in other social media platforms, Christine Mendoza. I am frighteningly easy to find on Reddit. So.
Terrific. Well, listen, thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules. 2 of you traveled across the country to come here. Joe was in the same time zone, but of course made time out of his busy schedule to be here with us. And I really do appreciate that work. And I also appreciate your continued partnership and exchanging ideas with you. I also want to invite everyone here to reach out to us here during this final day of the conference. We only have a few hours left, but we'll be here, and we'd love to talk to you about tech and accessibility and open source. And with that, thank you all for coming and joining us for the panel. Hope you have a great rest of your conference.